Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. We are going to, again today, handle your questions. I have a Q&A period. This has, again, been fun for us as you've been sending in your questions over time. We appreciate them. They are very thoughtful, and it does supply an entire, well, for me, it was a week of thought and discussion and asking others and doing my own research on some things I hadn't thought of as carefully as the person who asked the questions. So thank you again for that. So we'll jump in a moment. I wanted to mention, Mike, that the theology book, the systematic theology book, based on a Divine Counsel Worldview, we haven't settled on a title, by the way, yet. I've heard that the title is the last thing you write when you write a book. Because and even your editor or your publisher may have final say. But the concept of writing a book of this size and this magnitude is constantly shocking me, in the sense that I've got 20 some years in the college classroom and 15 years in the pastorate, and this kind of material that you have come up with over this time, and especially with technology where you've saved it all into electronic files and such. I'm noticing that, and let me throw this at you because you're in the midst of your D-Min, and the olden days, I'd say, based on, I was going to school in the 70s, was that you would write a paper, of course, with pen and paper, and then you would take time and type it, and the typed version, clack, 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 was, it took several days on its own. And it was a very manual, obviously, process, and kind of an analog process. And compare that to the technology of today, the digital process. I've found that even when I wrote my dissertation for my PhD, you didn't write it the same way. What you did was, and at least this worked for me, you had every chapter of your book or your, in my case, dissertation, open on the screen, tiles that you tile, front and back to each other. And you access any part of the book at any time. So when you're reading this or reading that, and one thing will strike you as needing to go into chapter 4. Another, the next sentence you're reading will need to go into chapter 8, halfway through. And you're constantly writing the entire book. In other words, not just one chapter at a time. And I bring that up because I'm finding that in writing a theology of a Divine Counsel Worldview, it's so big because, again, everything touches everything else. And so that's where it is. We're in the middle of the summer right now as far as when we're recording this. And again, my hope is to have it done by the end of December. That's an aggressive hope still because, again, it just I'm finding it to be so fun at the same time as challenging for all the information that needs to go into this book. In fact, I've been working through the Divine Counsel, the Plural Elohim chapter. It's one chapter. Normally in a Reformed theology, it would be like the doctrine of angels, and I'm calling it the doctrine of divine beings. Well, that's like, and it's so far it's 200 pages, just that. Because there's so much that the Divine Counsel wants to say about this concept called divine, created divine beings. So, just want to drop that in that it's going well, but it's certainly a big project. How have you found, in your writing style, because you're heavily into the digital age as you do your doctoral work, how do you write a large paper?
I mean, I still do it, I guess, in some sense, linear process, but that's more of that. I have set chapters that I know that I need to do right now for my dissertation. And so I think just because of that structure, I'm sort of applying it more in a linear sense, but it really is also because the subject that I'm going through is actually they're not necessarily interconnected as like a systematic theology book would, right? Because that's true. I would imagine there's a lot of intertextuality and a lot of shared thoughts because you mentioned one idea here. It'll eventually propagate again in another subject because they are tied together somewhat. I noticed this pattern before with other theology books like Dr. Bird's Evangelical Theology. He would have 2-3 different sections talking about the Holy Spirit, but he's addressing different parts of what the Holy Spirit does.
Where do you put it is a good question.
Yeah. And so they're all interconnected in the end. I think with my particular focus, because it's more of a homiletical kind of topic, then it's a little bit more separated, siloed chapters. They are connected in a sense because they feed into each other, because it's supposed to feed towards a conclusion versus, the work that you're doing. I am absolutely in awe, and also I don't envy, because it's a lot to connect all that information, and especially with, you're working with, Dr. Heiser's previous materials as well, and the things that he was trying to put into that theology book before he passed.
Having a conversation with a theology partner who I can't talk to is very difficult sometimes, but it's also, and I'll use the word fun in an honest way, because it's a lifetime of hopes and dreams that I'm putting into a book. So, alrighty. Well, thank you, Mike. Let's jump into our first question. Again, I'm going to just, let me just summarize the question. The submitter sometimes would, give a lot of background to what they're asking, and then they get to the question. So let me just each time describe the question, and the submitter will probably hear themselves or know who they're talking about or who sent it in. So, or they'll hear themselves as they hear the question. The first question is, and I'm titling it, How Submissive Was Jesus to Mary? We had talked about in the wedding Cana story of John 2 about Jesus and Mary. Here comes the question. Clarify the relationship between the human Jesus and his mother Mary. When at the temple as a young boy, Jesus was in submission to Mary. Was he still in submission to Mary in the story of turning water into wine in John 2? By the way, there is some conversation like this, or about, and maybe we mentioned it when we got there, that Jesus calls his mother woman, right? Gune in John 2. And some have taken that as an offensive or maybe a sociological, abrupt way of talking to your own mother. But again, that's just normal conversation for the ancient world to use the woman or the word gune. So I don't think there was any hint there in that story of Jesus being uncouth or unkind to his own mother. Here's my quick response back, and then Mike jump in. Whether in childhood, remember the one quick story, 12 verses about Jesus being 12 in Luke 2, or during his active ministry, we've got this story. Actually, Jesus' relationship to Mary is rather, quick and parceled out in the New Testament record. It's very short. We have this in John 2. We also have in Mark 3, where Mary and his Jesus' siblings seem to be coming to Jesus in nervousness, hoping that he has not extended himself to the point of being in physical danger. They try to pull him, as it were, away from the crowds. And some even have read into the Mark 3, verses 21 through 35 story, that Mary was part of this belief that Jesus was out of his mind and he needed to be, pulled in, as it were. I don't know if I would read it that far, but so you have those three: Luke 2, John 2, and Mark 3. Or at the moment of his death, where Jesus, of course, talks from the cross to his mother and gives her into the care of the beloved disciple. That's in John 19. In all of these stories, I would just say this. I don't have more to add to my answer or to the questioner than this, that it appears that Jesus related to his mother as any maturing, I may even add godly, righteous person would or should relate to their parents. Whether in submission in Luke 2, obviously he's a young boy, or even in telling his mother, now is not my time, or my time has not yet come. And you have that interplay in John 2 that is a bit mysterious. We're not given a lot of the background there. I would just say it generally. How submissive was Jesus to Mary? He was proper in every way. From what the Bible record shows, he's always in a proper relationship to his mom. Anything you want to add to that?
I think that's pretty much, that pretty much sums it up for me as well. I was actually having this conversation with someone a few days ago where we were talking about that very incident in John 2 of him referring to Mary as woman. And it's interesting, if we were to flip that around, if it was Jesus talking to another person, like a male, but instead of using the name, he just simply said man, would we in our 21st century ears perked up? Probably not. Right. And so it really is an interesting kind of, it says more about our culture and the way that we've been trained in our own culture these days, where we notice words like that more astutely versus this was more of a common way of addressing. And I could imagine it was more polite just because this is a wedding setting. This is a very public venue. People are coming in and out and they would hear. And, I wouldn't say words like Abba to my parent when they're total strangers, walking around the crowd. And so I would think that this was actually more of a proper way of addressing your mother, especially in a public setting. And so,
plus, he spoke in Aramaic, and it's translated into Greek. So who knows in that translational move what he actually said. So,
yeah, and so I think I would imagine that Jesus was as obedient as we would expect of a righteous Jewish boy growing into a man. And nothing he did was explicitly harmful or detrimental to his mother or really to anyone else around him. I mean, besides the moment of his family trying to pull him away from ministry because they thought that he was going mad. I would say also that incident does. That incident itself also he used to actually show that ultimately even your physical family relationships, those that you're connected to by blood, it is shadowed by the greater relationship that is to come eschatologically with the greater family of God. That who are my mother and who are my brothers and my sisters? Everyone who is doing the will of the Father.
Good teaching point. Thank you. Let's head on to a second question. This is a good one. And again, I'll just summarize what the questioner asked. What is the best argument against the thought that the divine counsel does not actually exist, but is just a divine accommodation? This is John Walton's view. For those of you who have read John Walton's works, and Dr. Walton and Mike, Dr. Heiser did have a little bit of interplay, but not a lot, And so now today, without Dr. Heiser being alive to respond to Dr. Walton, this has been a question of some listeners, is how Walton's view and Dr. Heiser's view compare. And Dr. Walton has gone on record to say that Yahweh used, or the Bible uses, DC language as a symbolic means to an end. It's a cosmological view of the heavens that are accommodating how the rest of the world would have thought of Yahweh and his, here we go, a council of gods. So let's put it that way. What is the best argument against the idea that it's just divine accommodation? It's a good question, one that I think anyone who is in a divine counsel worldview world or, thinking through that lens as they look at the Bible, to be honest with the text, what's the chance that maybe this is just accommodation language? Let me give you my thoughts, Mike. The idea of a council, I think we should, and I've said this in our conversations, the very word council of God certainly does employ symbolism, in the sense that when we hear in English council, we think of a big table with chairs and people sitting around discussing what to do about next quarter. Well, that's not, I don't think, by any means what we have in the biblical record. The closest the word council in English, council, as it comes into English out of the Hebrew word edah in Psalm 82, for example. It's a common word, used dozens of times in the Old Testament, and usually it's for the congregation of Israel in many of the places in the narrative going through the wilderness wanderings when it talks about the congregation of Israel. The word there, edah, is the same word translated into council in Psalm 82. So it can just mean group, and that's why, as even Dr. Heiser and I would talk over the years, he would use the word council. I would use the idea of a plural Elohim issue being more important than a divine counsel issue. So here's even the name of our podcast may be a bit a misrepresentative of where I am in the question of, is the word counsel accommodation? I would say to some degree it is, because however these beings relate to Yahweh, and I think Daniel 7 is my favorite story, where, of course, the purpose of Daniel 7 is to inspire awe and grandeur and splendor when Yahweh is surrounded by, what does it say? Thousands of thousands and 10,000s of 10,000s. The bigger the grander the king, the greater his court, greater his entourage. And so the story of the Old Testament to me in general is that Yahweh is surrounded by an innumerable host of created divine beings that exist solely for the purpose of well, not solely, but largely for the purpose, I guess we could say, of telling the creation, even in song or in words, that Yahweh is great and to be admired. And to me, that's more likely how I would think of the council concept. And so, what do you think? I think the issue is whether created divine beings actually exist. And that's where, okay, now we need to get into the text as to whether this God in a certain text exists. That to me is a better question than does a divine council exist?
See, I think it's interesting, right? Because language itself is always going to be using some sort of accommodation. It's going to be using some sort of known factor that the speaker or the writer knows about his or her audience, right? So, for us, who are in the United States, we generally don't think of throne rooms, councils, assemblies of lawmakers all in one place, all speaking to one monarch at the same time. We don't generally think that way. Yet I've brought this up several times, even in our own episodes when we've talked about this concept, that for me, like just watching even period dramas of South Korean origins, that there are these images now that appear in my mind of that a council is not just simply only the lawmakers, but really pretty much anyone that is part of the court, even the security, even the soldiers, making sure that nothing funny or fishy is about to happen inside that room, because all these important people, essentially these lawmakers, these policymakers, these advisors to the king, all of them have to be protected. So even the soldiers are, in a sense, a part of what is going on within the council. And the cool thing about the drama that I was thinking of is that even some of the soldiers themselves, the bodyguards of the king, are even in on the know of certain machinations that the king is about to do. And so that, there's that interesting thing that council, I think, can be expanded beyond just simply a gathering, but that there is activity that is going on. It's not just like a place, but it is also, it incorporates what is the whole job, in sense of what is going on in this room.
And is it fair then to say, let's move the question from council to plural Elohim? Is that an accommodation idea, that plural Elohim actually exist? To that answer, I say, well, yes, the DCW is sold on the idea that these are real spirit, whatever that means, beings, created spirits who actually have a role to play in the cosmos. How do we defend that from accommodation? I would say, and again, I'll throw it out to you, see what you think. I'll grant that Job 1 may be symbolic to some degree, where, God is pictured as minding his own business and the Satan comes into the room and says, hey, what do you think? And, in other words, it's played out almost a bit, dramatically. And so it could be thought of as a drama. I have a good Christian pastor friend, evangelical, who is preaching through Job, and he presented Job 1 and 2 as simply a dramatic way of describing some kind of spiritual warfare going on in the story, right? So I'm able to grant that even there we may have accommodation. Here's where I would go, is to say, well, we have to do something with a Gabriel coming to the door of Mary, Luke 1, Luke 2, and knock, knock, knock. I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of Yahweh. I'm here to tell you XYZ. We have stories like this where something's happening that the text is presuming to a very intelligent audience that this being is not human, right? I come from the presence of Yahweh. So to me, as soon as I get the reader, or the listener to say, I've got some divine beings in the Bible, they're there and it's presumed. And then Jesus himself talking about the angels coming, with him on the clouds, whatever. If I can amass various passages where it's understood and presumed that there are divine beings, I think I've won the argument, or at least said, okay, that's all I'm saying, is that we have divine beings. Now the second question, or the resultant direction of speech would go, who are they? Are they what we want to call angels, or are they something more than that? And so that's where I think Walton needs to be honest and say, if he's, and I'm not challenging him. I'm just saying any academic, whatever their view on the gods is, take a good example of one in the Bible, tell me what you think about it, and then step back and now create a theology of these beings based on what else you know. And to me, that's where a DCW is its most potent. We're simply being honest with the text as evangelicals and saying that every writer in the Bible presumed they were real. So let's do it too and see what happens. And to me, it becomes a very finely tuned engine.
I mean, wouldn't it also be fair to say, I mean, this is also kind of gets into the issue about not just Israel, but just also with other, Canaanite cultures, even Egyptian cultures, because I know for Walton, that is generally one of his areas of focus, Mesopotamian and Egyptian. And even within that, the royal, the royal monarchy, the human monarchy was played off as though it was a mirror image of the spiritual realm as well, right? You have the Pharaoh, who is the son of the high god of the Egyptian religion. And that in many ways, what he says on earth is a reflection of what is being said and, executed out in heaven, with these other spiritual beings. And to my surprise, a couple of years ago, as I was starting to learn more about this divine council material, folks that were investigating, for example, Eastern Orthodoxy, that they informed me that this was actually part of some of the older version of how the old kingdoms, like the United Kingdom itself. And you even see a glimpse of that in the ritual and the blessing of the inauguration and the coronation of the king or the queen. That there is this sense of what is happening in heaven is happening here on earth. But of course, because it's Christianized, it's a little bit not so much that the king or the queen is an exact analog to the high king of heaven. But there are like these shadows and these hints that this used to be a little bit more one-to-one, that whatever the king decides to do here on earth is a reflection of what God in heaven wanted also to have done on earth. And so a part of me just thinks there's a little bit of sometimes we want to ignore that historical perspective that a lot of the ancient cultures, even closer to the time of the biblical writings, had these kind of mirrored realities in their thinking. And a part of me is like, if this is part of their culture, if this was part of the general mindset of other human cultures around Israel, why is it hard for us to just simply factor that into the text?
Yeah. That's a good point. And you'd think that and I have an entire chapter of this in my dissertation, which is going into the theology book, how many times Yahweh himself speaks of other Elohim. It's stunning. I created a list for my own dissertation, and it was a couple of pages long of just the text. Bam, 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 where Yahweh says, don't do this, or do this. And at any point, God could have stopped and said, by the way, they're not even real, so don't get overly tied up with them. But he never does. It's a constant appeal to their reality, thus their danger, right? So anyway, thank you. And I should say in closing that question, be ready, and you said it very well, that all God talk is accommodation to some degree. As soon as you get into the divine world, we have to speak in accommodated language. And so you can find lists of this either in AI or, Google, or in your textbooks. You can find lists of accommodation language, whether it be anthropomorphism, anthropopathism, where you use emotions of the human race when speaking of God, like God regretted he made man, Genesis 6:6. I don't see God, wringing his hands up in heaven going, oh no, what did I do? But the text makes it feel as though he's beside himself. What's he going to do, right? And so I think we have examples of this or walking in the garden, anthropomorphism. Maybe he did, or maybe, again, the word there just means to go, Derek. And so it doesn't say how he propelled himself. God remembered Noah, Genesis 9 or 8:1. It doesn't mean that God all of a sudden remembered like he had forgotten about him. But that's the way the Bible comes to us. And so be ready for the Bible to be using accommodation language quite a bit, especially in the divine realm. But what we're left with for a DCW issue is, are these beings real? And if they are, which every Bible writer assumed it, every Bible reader assumed it, now read your Bible in that light and things change quite a bit. So,
Ron, before we
go ahead,
move on, I'm just curious. Have you ever heard of the story? I can't remember the title of it. It was written actually, ironically, by a minister. It was early 20th century, but it was a philosophical exercise, and it was about how a sphere is a circle. And what's going on is that this minister imagined a world that was 2D. All they had was length and width. And that's all they ever knew was length and width. So squares and circles and triangles would interact, and they were buddies and whatever else. And then one day, a sphere from the 3-dimensional world came into the 2-dimensional world.
Okay.
And the only thing that they could perceive was that for some reason, this circle got smaller and smaller and smaller, and then would switch immediately to becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and even disappear to a point. And they couldn't comprehend how was this happening. And it was only because all they could ever perceive was 2 dimensions. Yeah. And why I bring this up is because this is part of what's happening with accommodation, is that we're trying to use the closest human analogs that we have to describe what God is doing, or vice versa. God is using what we know from our human language and knowledge and trying to make that actually sensible to us.
Yeah.
I don't know. It always kind of amazes me that, there are books out there such as, a whole entire concept of like this God being called Cthulhu. And the whole point of that kind of narrative is that gods are so beyond the minds of human beings that if we were to ever encounter them, we would have gone insane. And yet, according to the scriptures, these gods do actually make the effort to make some sense to human beings. And that they actually are willing to make sense to human beings. And I do find that's a very interesting take. Anyways, I just throw that out there because I've always been interested. Why is it that people are upset about the accommodation, yet it is the accommodation that enables us to comprehend them?
Yeah, that's a good point. That if we didn't have accommodation, look out. I mean, it would be a pretty hard world to understand completely or at all. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Here's another one. This gets into Genesis way back when we started our podcast. I believe I heard Dr. Heiser say that the grammar and syntax of Genesis 1:1-3, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, make the gap theory improbable, if not impossible. Can you give your understanding of this and where I can research this more? As to the where to research it, I am not motivated much by that specific question. I'm aware of the gap theory. I would just say good commentaries on Genesis would be, where you could research this, my guess. Right, Mike? Otherwise...
Yeah, there's like John Goldingay's Genesis commentary. That's in the Baker line. And then there's also, I forget who's the author for the Word commentary.
Yep.
For Genesis. But yeah, a lot of that has to do, and Mike had addressed this before, and people can even do YouTube searches and they can find where he's actually discussing this. He did this on the Pure Normal, Fringe 321 type stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
The purpose of this gap theory, from what I was taught growing up, was that if you want to get time, a lot of time, even evolutionary length of time, millions, billions of years, you can get it theoretically between Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and 1:2, and the earth was formless and void. From what I understand lexically, to the questioner's question, the way to get around or to negate the possibility of a gap there is simply rendering or looking at ha yata in 1:2, and the earth was. the haya, the form of the haya there seems to simply be was and not became. Mm-hmm. So that's all I know about that question, and I would have to pass the questioner on to people better than me to get into the lexical arguments. And I'm not motivated by the question because I'm not personally an old age Earth person myself, so I don't even spend much time on the gap idea.
Yeah, and part of that also, what Mike had done in the past was that, and I actually did this. I presented this at my church for one of our discipleship classes. That the traditional interpretation is in the beginning, but grammatically, it is probably more accurate to say when God began to create. Right, that verses 1 and 2 are actually not part of the creational act. They're set up. Okay. That they are setting up. They're setting up the scene. It's like once upon a time, and so it's letting you know what is the time setting in the story. But that's it. It's not. It's just really interesting that people have been trying to find a way to slip in verses 1 and 2 when grammatically, it's more likely verses 1 and 2 were used to set up the scene of right. This is the problem that Yahweh, or God in this case, Elohim, is encountering, and the solution is in verse 3. He creates. He calls out, "Let there be light," to come into to fill up the void and the formlessness. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not a personal fan of the gap theory myself. It's a lot of gymnastics for something I don't necessarily feel is a real problem that has to be fixed. Right. Yeah. I don't spend mental energy on it. Very good. Let's go on to another. When discussing salvation, here's a good question that somebody asked, and it's worth our time because I have talked about this quite a bit. When discussing salvation, sin management, quote unquote, has been downplayed. Yet, my Jewish believers say that attitudes of the heart are intrinsically connected to one's behavior, with sin even separating us from God. For example, Isaiah 59:2, your sins have separated between you and your God. Well, that's a good point. I don't want to be misunderstood in the sense that, well, let me just read the answer that I would say to myself or to anyone. To me, you have to back up and ask the bigger question. So here I go. In answering, what does Jesus solve? Think about sin management for a moment. In answering, what does Jesus solve? The question of sin is certainly important, right? You can't come out of the Jesus story without, and Paul's and other New Testament writers' recollection of what Jesus did, without dealing with sin, because that is a word, hamartia in Greek, generally, that is talked about when it comes to Jesus forgiving it, and the high priest in Hebrews forgiving it and all that. So, yeah, there is a question that does have to revolve around sin. But here's again my argument from a DCW point of view. It appears that the Old Testament question is, to which God are you loyal? And once you get that question going from Genesis 4 and on, even Genesis 3 to me is a question of which God were Adam and Eve listening to. That once you start asking that question, even Jesus' teaching falls right into line with that. What's the greatest commandment? Love Yahweh your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. He is still committed to the central question of the Old Testament, which is, which God do you worship? Notice what you do, and here's how I would answer the questioner. What you do with sin management simply becomes a subset of that bigger question. So which God are you loyal to? That's the main question. Then, once you're loyal to the right God, now comes the question, how do we handle sin? What does that God think of sin? How does he handle it within his own family and those outside the family, shall we say? So the sin management question, I think, is there. It's just that it's a sub-story. It is not the most important story. And I'll leave it there for now, but go ahead and jump in if you'd like, and then I'll give some more thoughts. But yeah, I also wonder, and this is probably, I think in the West and in Western Christianity, we've kind of prioritized the issue with humanity being primarily sin, right? It really has in sin nature versus what seems to be the ultimate problem, especially from Genesis 3, is actually death.
Right.
That it's death, the decay, the corruption. That was the primary issue. Yes, sin leads to death, but ultimately that's the real problem. it's the ultimate problem, and it's the ultimate enemy that's finally destroyed and defeated in the book of Revelation. Right? It's not sin nature that's destroyed. It's actually death itself is thrown into the lake of fire and destroyed. Right. And so I do think there is that even the question itself is sort of revealing that it's assuming that sin is the number one problem for humanity. And from what I can tell from writings such as from Athanasius, for example, who talked about, about why the incarnation of Jesus was so important, that part of his reasoning was that the ultimate problem of humanity and really of the whole entire world is death or corruption in his words, or decay in his words, that everything is heading towards death without the source, without the creator of life. And so thus the only way that can ever be ultimately resolved is the creator of life, the one who can actually defeat death. Not the sin, it's more of, is it not death that actually causes us and motivates many of us to sin, that we're trying to avoid something dying in our lives, a hope, a dream that we did not want to die. And we'll lie, we'll steal, we'll do whatever it takes in order to keep the things that we care about alive. And yet ultimately in the end, we're trying to avoid death on many different levels. And so that's my take on it. I think the loyalty question is important because it then answers, well, who ultimately is going to be the one that solves the problem of death?
Right.
Is it going to be you, or is it going to be the creator?
That's a good point. And where my concern has been over these years with you, that we've known each other, and now that we're doing the podcast together, is that, for example, I just pulled a book off my shelf. What is the gospel? I forget the author. I don't even know the title, so I don't want to, pick on any certain author here. But let me read, for example, a paragraph that comes right under the heading, The Gospel. The gospel is that Christ has suffered the full wrath of God for my sin. Notice how quick sin management gets into the story in his definition of what is the gospel. Jesus Christ traded places with me, living the perfect life, the life I should have lived. There's sin management. Dying the death I have been condemned to die. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says he actually became my sin so that I could literally become his righteousness. Here's Athanasius. Then he quotes him. He called this the great exchange. He took my record, died for it, and offers me his perfect record in return. There's sin management again, popping its head out. He took my shameful nakedness to clothe me with his righteousness. When I received that grace in repentance and faith, full acceptance becomes mine. So if you're listening carefully, what you've done from the first sentence to the last, you start with full wrath of God for my sin, and you end with full acceptance becomes mine. But notice the path from A to Z, or from the beginning to the end, only deals with sin and how to get rid of that sin, or what he calls, or the answer then becomes, quote, the great exchange, to use Athanasius's word. That's what I'm nervous about, is that we have even defined the gospel in terms of simply sin management. And for that, I'd be willing to stand up and say no.
Well, and also, just because, Athanasius is mentioned, I was mentioning Athanasius, and yet that's, sorry, it's a little of a frustration because Athanasius is on the incarnation. I don't agree with everything. I mean, he was writing in the 4th century. Right, so we know a lot more. But his primary concern was really, why is the incarnation so important? Was because the one who created humanity, and we were made in his image, he's the only one that knows how to restore that image. Because of the corruption, because of the death, because of how everything has been just slowly breaking down.
Now, where I would say that sin management comes into the story, and we've been through this, so this is not new to anyone listening to our podcast, but there is what I would call kata management. There is, and I'm not going to go through the whole argument, but kata, the Hebrew word for sin, translated as sin, has a much broader meaning than moral guilt. It can also mean just ritual impurity that you have because you happen to be living in this world. And so there's a long path of thinking, going through atonement ritual in the Old Testament, where you start by saying ritual impurity is presumed when accessing God's presence. If I'm going to be in God's presence, the tabernacle or the temple, I'm going to need to be ritually pure. And I do believe Jesus solves that question through his death. There comes that again, the great exchange. I guess you could say there is a great exchange in my model as well, but the exchange is for ritual impurity for ritual purity. And so it's not the sin management model, I would call it kata management, which is then hopefully making the listener go, what do you mean by kata? Which then allows me to back up and retell the story with a word that does not have the moral overtones that we often think of sin. So again, if people have been listening to our podcast, they know where I go on this, but,
and Ron, I think in our first episode, we were answering that first QA episode, we were answering that question of subjects and areas for people to explore.
Yeah.
This is actually was what I was really kind of just trying to point out was I'm curious if the word kata or just the concept of that, did that morph over time during the Second Temple period, right? Did it go somehow beyond ritual impurity into something?
Well, yeah, it does mean more, but when it comes to the problem that Jesus solves, I would say is the ritual side. Yeah.
But that's why I suggested that as an area of focus, because I'm curious, because I do agree about the ritual purity issue. It's about also, well, did that ever eventually get expanded to issues such as high-handed sins during the Second Temple period, not the Old Testament? But I'm saying more about the Second Temple period, and if that is partly what influenced some of the later theologians. But anyways, that's a
good question that needs to be. In fact, I was going to do my dissertation on this, and I forget what derailed me. When I was finishing my doctoral work, I spent several weeks researching the idea of the high-handed sin as it turned into the New Testament era, and how that would have worked. Like, remember, Paul in Galatians says that what he did it ignorantly in unbelief. He spent his pre-Damascus Road experience, quote, ignorantly in unbelief. Well, how could Paul claim to be ignorant while killing Christians? And maybe he was appealing to the non-high-handed sin of Numbers 15. That was my theory, and I was playing it out. And again, to write a dissertation, you have to present a 30-page paper, to your committee, telling them, here's where I'm going, here's where I think I can get there, and they've got to agree to it. And I forget where in that process somebody or something stalled that out, and I went in another direction. But it was a fascinating subject to study.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those kind of curiosities for me, because it's because every so often I'll read something like, for example, like the Messiah Ben Joseph book by David Mitchell, and he would chronicle about how, especially during the Maccabean era, that the Jewish folks who died who were essentially martyred, that they were seen later on in the writings as that their sacrifices essentially help atone for the sins of the nation. And
that would be a different meaning, that probably atonement.
So that's why, I'm curious, how did the train of thought morph? And I'm wondering if there is something that maybe we're just missing, because I agree with what you're talking about the kata management here. But I do wonder if there is a little bit of something that happened also in the Second Temple period that might explain why did the church go into so much into this inclusion of murder, high-handed sins into what Jesus' death on the cross included.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's that goes back to our question then. What should I study in my grad work? Well, there you go. Plenty to do. All right, another one. Good question here. In fact, we'll make this the last one of our session today. Do Jews worship a different God? Okay, general question, and let me get specific as the questioner put it. How should we think of Jews who worship Yahweh but don't believe that Jesus is God? It seems they have chosen the correct deity, but is it possible that if they don't choose Jesus, then they are not choosing the correct God? Now here, there's been a lot of theological water under the bridge for thousands of years. So my answer is not meant to solve anything as much as just give you my opinion. I have been on two sides of this coin, and I'm not, to say that I believe what I'm about to say without mental reservation would be a lie. So am I allowed to have some views that I have mental reservation about? Absolutely. And here's one of them. Here's how I'd start the answer. What I do is I go to the end of the New Testament era, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, or Hebrews, or books that we know are written, even the Gospel of John, we know that are written late in the era of the New Testament, where they're settling out ideas that have been bantered about for a generation after Jesus' ascension, right? So here's how I'd say it. By the end of the New Testament era, the deciding factor in determining one's righteous standing, and I'll say generally here, this is the call they were making generally, was that a person's view of what God had done with and through Jesus was the question. What do you think Yahweh has done with Jesus? Now, notice what's packed in there is that I've got to believe in Yahweh. So that's going to be presumed before I even get to the question of what about the Messiah. And where I come up with this is the simplicity of a verse like 1 John 5:1. Whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. He's in the family. Well, notice how like a truism or a bromide or like a proverbial way of saying it. Here's the litmus test I want you to give your church, the writer is saying. Ask for a show of hands. How many of you believe that Jesus is the Christ? Jesus is the Christ born of God. Or I'm sorry, how many of you believe that Jesus is the Christ? Just say it that way. Now, notice what's packed in there is a lot of information, including, what do you mean the Messiah? The Messiah is sent by whom? In other words, there's going to be a lot of presumed background material that includes Yahweh, includes the whole Old Testament narrative, right? So I think there's a lot going into the question that naturally has to be admitted that you are in a transitional period in the New Testament era. You're coming through the book of Acts, which has a sermon theme that's very consistent. God sent Jesus. We killed him. He ascended. He's the Lord of Lords. So now worship him above any other God. That's the general theme of Acts 2, Acts 3, Acts 7, Acts 10, Acts 13. The sermons in Acts, you can pretty much follow a common outline there. And so here's how I'd say it again, even today. And again, Mike, I'm curious what you'd say. What is a Jew expected to believe today? If I'm up here in Minneapolis, there's a good number of Jews that live in one of our suburbs, our inner ring suburbs, St. Louis Park. And I've been there numerous times. I drive through there every day to work. And it's got a huge synagogue, and I've been there numerous times. Wonderful people, delightful Jewish community there. But by and large, of course, they don't believe in Jesus. What would I say? If I could walk into that synagogue and say something, what would I say? Here's what I'd say. The same thing that Jesus would have asked of a Jew during his ministry, he's asking you all today. Place your loyalty in the God of Israel while simultaneously believing what God is doing with and through his beloved Son, Jesus. And then I would see what their raise of hands would be. In other words, you'd say to the group, implied, do you believe in Yahweh? Absolutely, that's why we're here. Do you believe what he did with Jesus? That to me seems to be where the New Testament has come to at its end. And despite all the transitional questions of, Cornelius and what did he know before and all this, the question at the end of the book is, what do you do with Jesus? So God is the judge. And even in fact, Jesus is the judge, right? We find out in the book of John that God has given to Jesus the right to judge the living and the dead on this question. So I think packed into, the Philippian jailer, what must I do to be saved? Well, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. And I think that's, again, presuming that's a shortened way of saying, believe in the God of Israel and what he is doing with Jesus. Those kind of stock phrases of the New Testament aren't just stopping on Jesus, in other words. They're asking, do you believe what Yahweh has done with him? So that's my case. I don't have an answer. Notice I'm not saying or answering point blank, what does God do with the believing Jew? I'm just saying the question of the Bible, where I'm trying to put my weight in what I think, is quite strict on the question. We've got to settle what Yahweh did with Jesus. So that's where I would take it. Any thoughts there?
A lot. I mean, I was in Israel over 3 summers ago, and our tour guide is a very devout, believing Jew. He's not like uber Orthodox, but there were moments where we asked him, because it was actually like 2 seminaries doing this whole entire tour of Israel in the most evangelical geeky way, and because we wanted to actually learn more about the history and the actual sites, and not visit holy relics, which was generally where a lot of the tour guides are trained to do, apparently. Right. And he actually was trained, like he basically became the trainer in this particular company to train other tour guides how to actually, do tours for evangelical seminarians, because our minds go in a very particular way. Yeah. And, there were moments where, a few of us are just chatting and hanging out with him, and we asked him a question like, what do you think about Jesus? Because he would research so much about Jesus's movements. He even gave us his argument about where he believes Jesus's body was buried. And he would have this very detailed out reasoning of why. How long would it take to carry a human male body? How heavy would that be? How much time did they have before sunset? And he would actually tell us that he does believe that Jesus is a son of God.
Okay.
And that Jesus was a prophet. And that Jesus did do the miracles that that the Gospels wrote off, and that it does seem to be in line. He would even dare to say that Jesus was a Messiah.
Okay.
But if asked him the question, is he God? Oh, no. And then he would dive right into the pagan right. Constantine conspiracy theories right into that at that moment. And there was a little bit of sadness, I think, for all of us, sort of like, you're so close. Right. And we met other Jewish scholars too, who would come during these like evening sessions that we were required to be in and listen and learn. And we learned from an ultra, Orthodox Jewish woman scholar who talked about how she's been loving the Chosen series because of how Jewish Jesus is portrayed in that series. But again, no, he's not the Messiah. He's not God. He's not whatever you Christians have played him out to be, but he is very Jewish. And that they have really been coming around to seeing more of the Jewishness of Jesus and even the Jewishness of Paul. So I don't know. I think part of the hesitation I have with any answer is because it's such, the history between Jews and Christians is so bloody.
Right.
And that in many ways, the blindness that Paul even talked about his own people, that there was already blindness by the time he was writing. Over these 20 centuries, we between the two groups have only exacerbated that blindness. Mm-hmm. And I still think it's a miracle when I do encounter and read of Jewish folks who become Christian, who become Messianic Jews, because of what that will actually cost them, of how deeply that would cost them. And even here, when we were in Israel, and we asked this, this Jewish woman scholar, well, you have atheist Jews, you have Buddhist Jews, you have Hindu Jews. But what happens if a Jewish person in Israel comes to believe Jesus is the Messiah? And her reaction was, well, that person's no longer Jewish.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
What do you mean that person's no longer Jewish? It's like, yeah, even the state of Israel, even on their citizen card, they would strike out Jewish ethnicity, like it would no longer exist.
It's bizarre to me how it came to that view.
We were just completely speechless. Yeah. We were all flabbergasted of like how, and a part of her reasoning was, well, there's been a long history of agnostic Jews, a long history of atheistic Jews. There's been a long history of Buddhist Jews even. But with Christians, nope, it's either or.
Yeah. And it's good to know that God will be the final judge of this, and he will do the right thing for every soul. And of course, we should want God to accept every loyal Jew. I mean, that's my heart's desire, is that God sees the heart above all. And here I'm talking Bible, so I'm not. I think I'm on safe turf here. First of all, God goes by the heart. And Romans 2, he who is a Jew who is one inwardly, not outwardly. That kind of language is very Pauline as well. But now it comes down to what do they believe about Jesus. And the stunning nature of the New Testament is how sure Paul, Peter, James, and John, these writers, were of Jesus' belovedness by the Father. They were absolutely dumbstruck by all the eggs of God are in the basket of Jesus, and they were committed to that. And that's, so I don't want to let go of that, and I don't want to say to my Jewish friends, minimize Jesus. I feel very nervous to ever give the impression that we get to minimize who Jesus is based on how the New Testament treats him. At the same time, God knows the heart, so I will leave it at that. So. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Mike. And we will let it go. And thank you again, everyone, for submitting your questions. If you have any more, or as you have them, I'm sure things are coming to mind all the time. Submit them to, here's the address, questions, plural, .dcwp @gmail.com. And they will get to Mike. He will corral them, and we'll put them onto another podcast of Q&A. So until we talk again, may God bless you, keep you, and love each other well.